Part 6, the last part of a series of unfortunate events, The Vile Village, book number 7. And I'll read chapters 12 and 13, the last two chapters. There's the picture for chapter 12. Chapter 12. If you have reached this far in the story, you must stop now. If you take one step back and look at the book you are reading, you can see how little of this terrible, miserable story there is to go. But if you could know how much grief and woe are contained in these last few pages, you would take another step back, and then another, and keep stepping back until the vile village was just as small and distant as the approaching figure of Detective Dupin was, as the Bottle orphans embraced their friends in relief and joy. The Bottle orphans, I'm sorry to say, could not stop now. There is no way for me to travel backward in time and warn the Baudelaires that the relief and joy they were expecting at Foul Fountain were the last bits of relief and joy they would experience for a very long time. But I can warn you, unlike the Baudelaire orphans and the Quagmire triplets, and me and my dear departed Beatrice, can stop this wretched story at this very moment and see what happens at the end of the littlest elf instead. We can't stay here, Violet warned. I don't mean to cut short this reunion, but it's already afternoon, and Detective Dupin is coming down the street. The 5 children looked in the direction Violet was pointing, and could see the turquoise speck of Dupin's approaching blazer, and the tiny point of the light his flaming torch made as he drew near the courtyard. "Do you think he sees us?" Claus asked. "I don't know," Violet said, "but let's not stick around to find out. The VFD mob will only get worse when they discover we've broken out of jail." "Detective Dupin is the latest disguise of Count Olaf," Claus explained to the Quagmires. "And we know all about Detective Dupin," Duncan said quickly, "and we know what's happened to you. We heard everything that happened yesterday from inside the fountain," Isadora said. "When we heard you cleaning the fountain, we tried to make as much noise as we could, but you couldn't hear us over the sound of all that water." Duncan squeezed a whole puddle out of the soaked stitches of his left sweater sleeve. Then he reached under his shirt and brought out a dark green notebook. "We tried to keep our notebooks as dry as possible," he explained. "After all, there's crucial information in here." "We have all the information about VFD, Isadora said, taking out her notebook, which was pitch black. "The real VFD, that is, not the village of foul devotees." Duncan opened his notebook and blew on some of the damp pages. "And we know the complete story of poor Ja." Duncan was interrupted by a shriek behind him, and the 5 children turned to see 2 members of the Council of Elders staring at the hole in the uptown jail. Quickly, the Baudelaires and Quagmires ducked behind the foul fountain so they wouldn't be seen. One of the elders shrieked again and removed his crow hat to dab his brow with a tissue. "They've escaped," he cried. "Roll number 1742 clearly states that no one is allowed to escape from jail. How dare they disobey this rule? We should have expected this from a murderer and her 2 accomplices," the other elder said. "And look, they've damaged Foul Fountain. The beak is split wide open. Our beautiful fountain is ruined." "Those 3 orphans are the worst criminals in history," the first replied. "Look, there's Detective Dupin walking down the street. Let's go tell him what happened. Maybe he'll figure out where they've gone." "You go tell Dupin," the second elder said, "and I'll go call the Daily Punctilio. Maybe they'll put my name in the newspaper." The 2 members of the council hurried off to spread the news, and the children sighed in relief. "Close," Sunny said. "That was too close," Sunny replied. "Soon the whole district will be full of citizens hunting us down." Well, nobody's hunting us," Duncan said. "Isadora and I will walk in front of you, so you won't be spotted." "But where can we go?" Isadora asked. "This vile village is in the middle of nowhere." "I hoped Hector finished a self-sustaining hot air mobile home," Violet said, "and he promised to have it waiting for us. All we have to do is make it to the outskirts of town, and we can escape." "We can live forever up in the air?" Claus said, frowning. "Maybe it won't be forever," Violet replied. "Skaya," Sunny said, which meant it's either the self-sustaining hot air mobile home or being burned at the stake. "When you say it like that," Claus said, "I'm convinced." Everyone agreed, and Violet looked around the courtyard to see if anyone else had arrived yet. "In a place as flat as this one," she said, "you can see people coming from far away, and we're going to use that to our advantage. We'll walk along any empty street we can find, and if we see anyone coming, we'll turn a corner. We won't be able to get there as the crow flies, but eventually we'll be able to reach Nevermore Tree. Speaking of the crows, Claus said to the two triplets, how did you manage to deliver the poems by crow? How did you know we'd receive them? Let's get moving, Isadora replied. We'll tell you the whole story as we go along. The 5 children got moving. With the Quagmire triplets in the lead, the group of the youngsters peered down one street after another until they found one without a sign of anyone coming, and hurried out of the courtyard. Olaf smuggled us away in that item from the inn auction with the help of Esme Squalor, Duncan began, referring to the last time the Baudelaires had seen him and his sister. And he hid us for a while in the tower room of his terrible house. Violet shuddered. I haven't thought of that room in quite some time, she said. It's hard to believe that we used to live with such a vile man. Claus pointed to the distant figure who was walking toward them, and the 5 children turned onto another empty street. This street doesn't lead to Hector's house, he said, but we'll try to double back. Go on, Duncan. Olaf learned that you 3 would be living with Hector at the outskirts of this town, Duncan continued, and he had his associates build that hideous fountain. Then he placed us inside, Isadora said, and had us installed in the uptown courtyard, so he could keep an eye on us while he tried to hunt you down. We knew that you were our only chance of escaping. The children reached a corner and stopped, while Duncan peeked around it to make sure no one was approaching. He signaled that it was safe and continued the story. We needed to send you a message, but we were afraid it would fall into the wrong hands. Isadora had the idea of writing in couplets with our location hidden in the first letter of each line, and Duncan figured out how to get them to Hector's house, Isadora said. He'd done some research about migration patterns in large black birds, so he knew that crows would roost every night in the Nevermore Tree, right next to Hector's house. Every morning, I would write a couplet, and the 2 of us would reach up through the fountain's beak. There was always a crow roosting on the very tap of the fountain, Duncan said, so we would wrap a scrap of paper around its leg. The paper was all wet from the fountain, so it would stick easily. And Duncan's research was absolutely right. The paper dried off and fell at night, Isadora recited. That was a risky plan, Violet said. No riskier than breaking out of jail and putting your lives in danger to rescue us, Duncan said, and looked at the Baudelaires in gratitude. You saved our lives. Again. We wouldn't leave you behind, Claus said. We refused to entertain the notion. Isadora smiled and patted Claus on the head. Meanwhile, she said, we were trying to contact you. Olaf hatched a plan to steal your fortune and get rid of an old enemy at the same time. You mean Jacques, Violet said. When we saw him at the Council of Elders, he was trying to tell us something. Why does he have the same tattoo as Olaf? Who is he? His full name, Duncan said, flipping through his notebook, is Jacques Snicket. That sounds familiar, Violet said. I'm not surprised, Duncan said. Jacques Snicket is the brother of a man who... There they are, a voice cried. In an instant, the children realized that they had neglected to look in back of them, as well as in front of them, and around each corner. About 2 blocks behind them was Mr. Lesko, leading a small group of torch-carrying citizens straight up the street. The day was getting later, and the torches left long, skinny shadows on the sidewalk, as if the mob were being led by slithering black serpents instead of a man in plaid pants. There are the orphans, Mr. Lesko cried triumphantly. After them, citizens. Who are the other 2? Another asked. Who cares, Miss Morrow said, and waved their torch. They're probably more accomplices. Let's burn them at the stake, too. Why not? Said another elder. We already have torches and kindling, and I don't have anything else to do right now. Mr. Lesko stopped at a corner and called down a street the children couldn't see. Hey, everyone, he shouted. They're over here. The 5 children had been staring at the group of citizens, too terrified to get moving again. Sunny was the first to recover. Lilac, she shouted, and began crawling down the street as fast as she could. She meant something like, let's go, don't look behind you, let's just try to get to Hector and his self-sustaining hot air mobile home before the mob catches us and burns us at the stake. But her companions didn't need any encouragement. Down the street they raced, paying no attention to the footsteps and shouts behind them, which seemed to be growing in number as more and more people heard the news that VFD's prisoners were escaping. The children ran down narrow alleys and wide main streets across parks and bridges that were all covered in black feathers. Occasionally they had to retrace their steps, a phrase which here means turn around and run the other way when they saw townspeople approaching. And often they had to duck into doorways or hide behind shrubbery while angry citizens ran by, as if the children were playing a game of hide-and-go-seek instead of running for their lives. The afternoon wore on, and the shadows of VFD streets grew longer and longer, And still the sidewalks echoed with the sounds of the mob's cries, and the windows of the buildings reflected the flames of the torches the townspeople were carrying. Finally, the 5 children reached the outskirts of towns and stared at the flat, bare landscape. The Baudelaires searched desperately for a sign of the handyman and his invention, but only the shapes of Hector's house and the barn and Nevermore tree were visible on the horizon. "Where's Hector?" Isadora said frantically. "I don't know," Violet said. "He said he'd be at the barn, but I don't see him." "Where can we go?" Duncan cried. "We can't hide anywhere around here. The citizens will spot us in a second." "We're trapped," Claus said, his voice with a panic. "For Rio," Sunny cried, which meant, "Let's run, or in my case, crawl, as fast as we can." "We'll never run fast enough," Violet said, pointing behind them. "Look." The youngsters turned around and saw the entire village of foul devotees marching together in a huge group. They had rounded the last corner and were now heading straight toward the 5 children, their footsteps as loud as a roll of thunder. But the youngsters did not feel as if it was thunder that was rolling toward them. As hundreds of fierce and angry citizens approached, it felt like the rolling of an enormous root vegetable. It felt like a root vegetable that could crush all the reptiles in Uncle Monty's collection in 5 seconds flat, or one that could soak up every drop of water in Lake Lachrymose in an instant. The approaching crowd felt like the root vegetable that made every tree in the night forest look like a tiny twig, made the huge lasagna served at the Proof Rock Preparatory School cafeteria look like a light snack, and made the skyscraper at 667 Dark Avenue look like a dollhouse made for midget children to play with. A root vegetable so tremendous in size that it would win every first-place ribbon in every starchy farm crop competition in every state and every county fair in the entire world from now until the end of time. The march of the torch-wielding mob, eager to capture Violet and Claus and Sunny and Duncan and Isadora and burn each of them at the stake, felt like the largest potato the Baudelaire orphans and the Quagmire triplets had ever encountered. Wow, that was a long sentence. Chapter 13, and there's the picture. Last chapter, chapter 13. The Baudelaires looked at the Quagmires, and the Quagmires looked at the Baudelaires, and then all 5 children looked at the mob. All the members of the Council of Elders were walking together, their crow-shaped hats bobbing in unison. Mrs. Morrow was leading a chant of burn the orphans, which the Verhoeven family was taking up with spirit, and Mr. Lesko's eyes were shining as brightly as his torch. The only person missing from the mob was Detective Dupin, who the children would have expected to be leading the crowd. Instead, Officer Luciana walked in front, scowling below the visor of her helmet as she led the way in her shiny black boots. In one white-gloved hand, she was clutching something covered in a blanket, and with the other hand she was pointing at the terrified children. "There they are," Officer Luciana cried, pointing her white-gloved finger at the 5 terrified children. "They have nowhere to go." "She's right," Claus cried. "There's no way to escape." "Machina," Sunny shrieked. "There's no sign of Deus Ex Machina, Sunny," Violet said, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't think anything helpful will arrive unexpectedly." "Machina," Sunny insisted, and pointed at the sky. The children took their eyes off the approaching mob and looked up, and there was the greatest example of Deus Ex Machina they had ever seen. Floating just above the children's heads was the superlative sight of the self-sustaining hot air mobile home. Although the invention had been quite marvelous to look at in Hector's studio, it was truly wondrous now that it was actually being put to use, and even the angry citizens of VFD stopped chasing the children for a moment, just so they could stare at this amazing sight. The self-sustaining hot air mobile home was enormous, as if an entire cottage had somehow detached itself from the neighborhood and was wandering around the sky. The 12 baskets were all connected and floating together like a group of rafts, with all of the tubes, pipes, and wires twisted around them like a huge piece of knitting. Above the baskets were dozens of balloons in varying shades of green. Fully inflated, they looked like a floating crop of crisp, ripe apples glistening in the last light of the afternoon. The mechanical devices were working at full force, with flashing lights, spinning gears, ringing bells, dripping faucets, whirring pulleys, and 100 other gadgets all going at once. But miraculously, the self-sustaining hot air mobile home was as silent as a cloud. As the invention sailed toward the ground, the only sound that could be heard was Hector's triumphant shout. "Here I am," the handyman called from the control basket. "And here it is, like a bolt from the blue. Violet, your improvements are working perfectly. Climb aboard and we'll escape from this wretched place." He flicked a bright yellow switch, and a long ladder made of rope began to unfurl down to where the children were standing. "Because my invention is self-sustaining," he explained, "it is designed to come back down to the ground, so you'll have... It isn't designed to come back down to the ground, so you'll have to climb this ladder up." And that must be what the picture on the front is. Duncan caught the end of the ladder and held it for Isadora to climb up. "I'm Duncan Quagmire," he said quickly, "and this is my sister Isadora." "Yes, the bottlers have told me about you," Hector said. "I'm glad you're coming along. Like all mechanical devices, this self-sustaining hot air mobile home actually needs several people to keep it running." "Aha!" cried Mr. Lesko, as Isadora hurriedly climbed the ladder with Duncan right behind her. The mob had stopped staring at the Deus Ex Machina and was now marching once again towards the children. "I knew it was a mechanical device. All those buttons and gears can't fool me." "Why, Hector," an elder said, "Rule number 67 clearly states that no citizens are allowed to build or use any mechanical devices." "Burn him at the stake, too," cried Mrs. Morrow. "Someone get extra kindling." Hector took a deep breath and then called down to the mob without a trace of skittishness in his voice. "No one's going to be burned at the stake," he said firmly, as Isadora reached the top of the ladder and joined Hector in the control basket. "Burning people at the stake is a repulsive thing to do." What's repulsive is your behavior," an elder cried. "The children have murdered Count Olaf and you have built a mechanical device. You have both broken very important rules." "I don't want to live in a place with so many rules," Hector replied in a quiet voice, "or a place with so many crows. I'm floating away from here, and I'm taking these 5 children with me. The Baudelaires and the Quagmires have had horrible times since their parents died. The village of foul devotees ought to be taking care of them instead of accusing them of things and chasing them through the streets." "But who's going to do our chores?" an elder asked. "The snack hut is still full of dirty dishes from our hot fudge sundaes." "You should do your own chores," the handyman said, as he leaned over to lift Duncan aboard his invention, "or take turns doing them according to a fair schedule. The aphorism, 'It takes a village to raise a child,' not 3 children should clean up after a village." The Baudelaires climbed aboard. "Let's leave these terrible people behind us." The Baudelaires smiled at one another and began climbing up the rope ladder. Violet went first, her hands clutching the scratchy rope as tightly as she could, and Claus and Sunny followed closely behind. Hector turned the knob, and the mobile home rose up higher just as the crowd reached the end of the ladder. "They're getting away," another elder called, her crow-shaped hat bobbing with frustration. She jumped to try to grab the edge of the ladder, but Hector had maneuvered his invention too high for her to reach. "The rule breakers are getting away. Officer Luciana, do something." "I'll do something, all right," Officer Luciana said with a snarl, and tossed away the blanket that she had been holding. From halfway down the ladder, the 3 climbing Baudelaires looked down and saw a large, wicked-looking object in Luciana's hands, with a bright red trigger and 4 long, sharp hooks. "You're not the only one with a mechanical device," she called up to Hector. "This is a Harpoon Gun, and that my boyfriend bought for me. It fires 4 hooked harpoons, which are long spears perfect for popping balloons." "Oh no," Hector said, looking down at the children. "Raise the self-sustaining hot air mobile home, Hector," Violet called. "We'll keep climbing." "Our chief of police is using a mechanical device?" Miss Morrow asked in astonishment. "That means she's breaking rule number 67 too." "Officers of the law are allowed to break rules," Luciana said, aiming the harpoon gun in Hector's direction. "Besides, this is an emergency. We need to get those murderers down from there." Members of the mob looked at one another in confusion, but Luciana merely gave them a lipstick smile and pressed the harpoon gun's trigger with a sharp click, followed by a swoosh, as one of the hooked harpoons flew out of the gun straight towards Hector's invention. The handyman managed to maneuver the self-sustaining hot air mobile home so the harpoon did not hit a balloon, but it struck a metal tank on the side of one of the baskets, making a large hole. "Drat," Hector said, as a purplish liquid began to pour out of the hole. "That's my supply of cranberry juice. Baudelaires, hurry up. If she causes any serious damage, we're all doomed." "We're coming as fast as we can," Claus cried. But as Hector moved his invention even higher in the air, the rope ladder was shaking so much that the Baudelaires could not move very fast at all. Click, swoosh. Another harpoon threw through the air and landed in the 6th basket, sending a cloud of brown dust fluttering to the ground, followed by some thin metal tubes. "She hit our supply of whole wheat flour," Hector cried, "and a box of our extra batteries." "I'll hit a balloon with this one," the officer cried. "Then you'll fall to the ground where we can burn you at the stake." "Officer Luciana," said one of the council of elders in the crowd, I don't think you should break the rules in order to capture people who have broken the rules. It doesn't make sense. Hear, hear, called out a townsperson from the opposite side of the crowd. Why don't you put the harpoon gun down, and we'll walk over to the town hall and have a council meeting? It's not cool, called out a voice, to have meetings. There was a rumble, as if another large potato had arrived, and the crowd parted to reveal Detective Dupin riding through the mob on a motorcycle, painted turquoise to match his blazer. Below his sunglasses was a grin of triumph, and his bare chest swelled with pride. Detective Dupin is using a mechanical device too? An elder asked. We can't burn everyone at the stake. Dupin isn't a citizen, another member of the council pointed out, so he's not breaking rule number 67. But he's riding through the crowd of people, Mr. Lesko cried, and he's not wearing a helmet. He's not showing good judgment, that's for sure. Detective Dupin ignored Mr. Lesko's lecture about motorcycle safety and pulled to a stop beside Officer Luciano. It's cool to be late, he said, and snapped his fingers. I was buying today's edition of the Daily Punctilio. You shouldn't be buying newspapers, said an elder, shaking his crow hat in disapproval. You should be catching criminals. Hear, hear, said several voices in agreement. But the crowd was beginning to look uncertain. It is hard to work, to be fierce, all afternoon as the situation grew more complicated. The citizens of EFD seemed a bit less bloodthirsty. A few townspeople even lowered their torches, which had been heavy to hold up all this time. But Detective Dupin ignored this change in VFD's mob psychology. Leave me alone, you crow-headed fool, he said to the elder, and snapped his fingers. It's cool to fire away, Officer Luciana. It certainly is, Luciana said, and looked up into the sky to aim the harpoon gun again. But the self-sustaining hot air mobile home was no longer alone in the sky. In all the commotion, no one had noticed that the afternoon was over, and the VFD crows had left their downtown roost to fly in circles before migrating to the Nevermore tree to spend the night as usual. Now the crows were arriving, thousands and thousands of them, and in seconds the evening sky was covered in black, muttering birds. Officer Luciana could not see Hector and his invention. Hector could not see the Baudelaires, and the Baudelaires could not see anything. The rope ladder was right in the path of the migrating crows, and the three children were absolutely surrounded by the birds of VFD. The wings of the crows rustled against the children, and their feathers began tangled in the ladder, and all the three siblings could do was hang on for dear life. Baudelaires, Hector called down. Hang on for dear life. I'm going to fly even higher, over the crows. No, Sonny cried, which meant, I'm not sure that's the wisest plan. We won't survive a fall from such a height. But Hector couldn't hear over another click and swoosh from Luciana's harpoon gun. The Baudelaires felt the rope ladder jerk sharply in their hands and then twist dizzily in the crow-filled air. From up in the control basket, the Quagmire triplets looked down and caught a glimpse through the migrating crows of some very bad news. The harpoon hit the ladder, Isadora called down to her friends in despair. The rope was coming unraveled. It was true. As the crows began to settle in at the Nevermore tree, the Baudelaires could see more clearly, and they stared up at the ladder in horror. The harpoon was sticking out of one of the ladder's thick ropes, which was slowly uncurling around the hook. It reminded Violet of the time when she was much younger and had begged her mother to braid her hair so she could look like a famous inventor she had seen in a magazine. Despite her mother's best efforts, the braids had not held in their shape and had come unraveled almost as soon as she tied her ends with a ribbon. Violet's hair had slowly spun out of the braid, just as the strands of rope were spinning out of the ladder now. Climb faster, Duncan screamed. Climb faster. No, Violet said quietly, then said it again so her siblings could hear. More and more crows were taking their places in the tree, and Claude and Sunny could see Violet's grim face as she looked down at them in despair. No. The eldest Baudelaire took another look at the unraveling rope and saw that they couldn't possibly climb up the basket of Hector's self-sustaining air mobile home. It was just as impossible as her mother ever braiding her hair again. We can't do it, she said. If we keep trying to climb up, we'll fall to our death. We'll have to climb down. But, Claus said. No, Violet cried. A one tear rolled down her cheek. We won't make it, Claus. You'll, Sunny said. No, Violet said again, and looked at her siblings in the eye. The three Baudelaires shared a moment of frustration and despair that they could not follow their friends, and then, without another word, they began climbing down the unraveling ladder, through the murder of crows still migrating to Nevermore tree. When the Baudelaires climbed down 9 rungs, the rope unbraided completely, and dropped the children onto the flat landscape, unhappy but unharmed. "Hector, maneuver your invention back down," Isadora cried. Her voice sounded a bit faint from so far away. "Duncan and I can lean out of the basket and make a human ladder. There's still time to retrieve them." "I can't," Hector said sadly, gazing down at the Baudelaires, who were standing up and untangling themselves from the fallen ladder, as Detective Dupin began to stride toward them in his plastic shoes. "It's not designed to return to the ground." "There must be a way," Duncan cried, but the self-sustaining hot air mobile home only floated farther away. "We could try to climb Nevermore Tree," Claus said, "and jump into the control basket from its height branches." Violet shook her head. "The tree is already half covered in crows, and Hector's invention is flying too high." She looked up into the sky and cupped her hands to her mouth, so her voice could travel all the way up to her friends. "We can't reach you now," she cried. "We'll try to catch up with you later." Isadora's voice came back so faintly that the Baudelaires could scarcely hear it over the muttering of the crows, who were still settling themselves in Nevermore Tree. "How can you catch up with us later?" she called. "In the middle of the air." "I don't know," Violet admitted, "but we'll find a way, I promise." In the meantime, Duncan called back, "Take these." The Baudelaires could see the triplets holding his dark green notebook, and Isadora holding hers, and over the side of the basket. "This is all the information we have about Olaf's evil plan, and the secret of VFD, and Jacques Snickett's murder." His voice was as trembly as it was faint, and the three siblings knew their friend was crying. "It's the least we can do," he called. "Take our notebooks, Baudelaires," Isadora cried, "and maybe someday we'll meet again." The Quagmire triplets dropped their notebooks out of the self-sustaining hot air mobile home and called out goodbye to the Baudelaires, but the farewell was drowned out by another click and another swoosh of Officer Luciana's fired one last harpoon. After so much practice, I'm sorry to say, her aim had improved, and the hook hit exactly what Luciana hoped it would. The sharp spear sailed through the air and hit not one but both Quagmire notebooks. There was a loud ripping noise, and then the air was filled with sheets of paper tossing this way and that in the rustling wind made by the flying crows. The Quagmires yelled in frustration and called out one last thing down to their friends. But Hector's invention had flown too high for the Baudelaires to hear. "Volunteer!" the children heard dimly, and then the self-sustaining hot air balloon floated too high for the orphans to hear anything more. "Test beer!" Sunny cried, which meant let's try to gather up as many pages of the notebook as we can. "If test beer means all is lost, then that baby isn't stupid after all," said Detective Dupin, who had reached the Baudelaires. He opened his blazer, exposing more of his pale and hairy chest, and took a rolled-up newspaper out of the inside of his pocket, looking down at the children as if they were 3 bugs he was about to squash. "I thought you want to see the Daily Punctilio," he said, and unrolled the newspaper to show the headline. "Baudelaire Orphans at Large," it read, using a phrase which here means not in jail. Below the headline were 3 drawings, one of each sibling's face. Detective Dupin removed his sunglasses so he could read the newspaper in the fading light. "Authorities are trying to capture Veronica, Clyde, and Susie Baudelaire," he read aloud, "who escaped from the uptown jail of the village of Foul Devotees, where they were imprisoned for the murder of Count Omar." He gave the children a Nazi smile and threw the Daily Punctilio down to the ground. "Some names are wrong, of course," he said, "but everybody makes mistakes. Tomorrow, of course, there will be another special edition, and I'll make sure that the Daily Punctilio gets every detail correct in the story about Detective Dupin's super cool capture of the notorious Baudelaires." Dupin leaned down to the children, so close that they could smell the egg salad sandwich he had apparently eaten for lunch. "Of course," he said in a quiet voice, so only the siblings could hear him. "One Baudelaire will escape at last minute, and live with me until the fortune is mine. The question is, which Baudelaire will it be? You still haven't let me know your decision." "We're not going to entertain that notion, Olaf," Violet said bitterly. "Oh no," an elder cried, and pointed at the flat horizon. By the light of sunset, the Baudelaires could see a small, slender shape sticking out of the ground, where the Quagmire pages fluttered by. It was the last harpoon Luciana had fired, and it had hit something else after destroying the Quagmire notebooks. There, pinned to the ground, was one of the VFD crows, opening its mouth in pain. "You harmed a crow," Miss Morrow said in a horror, pointing at Officer Luciana. "That's rule number 1, the most important rule of all." "Oh, it's just a stupid bird," Detective Dupin said, turning a face to the horrified citizens. "A stupid bird," an elder repeated, his crow hat trembling in anger. "A stupid bird. Detective Dupin, this is a village of foul devotees, and—" "Wait a minute," interrupted a voice from the crowd. "Look, everyone, he has only one eyebrow." Detective Dupin had removed his sunglasses to read the newspaper, reached into the pocket of his blazer, and put them back on again. "Lots of people have one eyebrow," he said, but the crow paid no attention as mob psychology began to take hold again. "Let's make him take off his shoes," Mr. Russell called, and an elder knelt down to grab one of Dupin's feet. "If he has a tattoo, let's burn him at the stake." "Hear, hear," a group of citizens agreed. "Now wait just a minute," Officer Luciana said, putting down the harpoon gun and looking at Dupin in concern. "And let's burn Officer Luciana too," Miss Morrow said. "She wounded a crow." "We don't want all these torches to go to waste," cried an elder. "Hear, hear." Detective Dupin opened his mouth to speak, and the children could see he was thinking frantically of something to say that would fool VFD's citizens. But then he simply closed his mouth, and with a flick of his foot, kicked the elder who was holding onto his shoe. As the mob gasped, the elder's crow-shaped hat fell off as she rolled to the ground, still clutching Dupin's plastic shoe. "It's the tattoo," one of the Verhoogans cried, pointing the eye in Detective Dupin's, or more properly, Count Olaf's left ankle. With a roar, Olaf ran back to his motorcycle, and, with another roar, he started the engine. "Hop aboard, Esme," he called out to Officer Luciana. The chief removed her motorcycle helmet with a smile, and the Baudelaire saw that it was indeed Esme Squalor. "It's Esme Squalor," an elder cried. "She used to be the city's sixth most successful financial advisor, but now she works with Count Olaf." "I heard the two of them are dating," Miss Morrow said in horror. "We are dating," Esme said in triumph. She climbed aboard Olaf's motorcycle and tossed her helmet to the ground, showing she cared no more about motorcycle safety than she did about the welfare of crows. "So long, Baudelaires," Count Olaf called, zooming through the angry crowd. "I'll find you again if the authorities don't find you first." Esme cackled as the motorcycle roared off across the flat landscape at more than twice the legal speed limit. So within moments the motorcycle was as tiny as a speck on the horizon as the self-sustaining hot air mobile home was in the sky. The mob stared after the two villains in disappointment. "We'll never catch up to them," an elder said with a frown. "Not without any mechanical devices." "Never mind about that," another elder replied. "We have more important things to attend to. Hurry, everyone. Rush this crow to the VFD vet." The Baudelaires looked at one another in astonishment as the citizens of VFD carefully unpinned the crow and began to carry it back into town. "What should we do?" Violet asked. She was talking to her siblings, but another member of the Council of Elders overheard and turned back to her. "Stay right here," she said. "Count Olaf and that dishonest girlfriend of his may have escaped, but you three are still criminals. We'll burn you at the stake as soon as this crow has received proper medical attention." The elder ran after the crow-carrying mob, and in a few seconds the children were alone in the flat landscape with only the shuffling of papers of the Quagmire notebooks for company. "Let's gather these up," Claus said, stooping down to pick up one badly ripped page. "They're our only hope of discovering the VFD secret." "And of defeating Count Olaf," Violet agreed, walking over to where a small stack of papers had blown together. "Fall on," Sunny said, scrambling after one that seemed to have a map scrawled on it. She meant, "and of proving that we're not murderers." And the children paused to look at the Bailey punctilio, which still lay on the ground. Their own faces stared back at them, below the headline, "Baudelaire Orphans at Large." But the children did not feel at large. The Baudelaires felt as small as could be, standing alone on the bare outskirts of VFD, chasing down the few pages of the Quagmire notebooks that were not gone forever. Violet managed to grab 6 pages, and Claus managed to grab 7, and Sunny managed to grab 9, but many of the recovered pages were ripped or blank or all crumpled from the wind. "We'll study them later," Violet said, gathering the pages together and tying them in a bundle with her hair ribbon. "In the meantime, we have to get out of here before the mob returns." "But where would we go?" Claus asked. "Burb," Sunny said, which meant anywhere, as long as it's out of town. "Who will take care of us out there?" Claus said, looking out on the flat horizon. "Nobody," Violet said. "We'll have to take care of ourselves. We'll have to be self-sustaining." "Like the hot air mobile home," Claus said, "that could travel and survive all by itself." "Like me," Sunny said, and abruptly stood up. Violet and Claus gasped in surprise as their baby sister took her first wobbly steps, and then walked closely beside her, ready to catch her as she fell. She didn't fall. Sonny took a few more self-sustaining steps, and then the three Baudelaires stood together, casting long shadows across the horizon in the dying light of the sunset. They looked up to see a tiny dot in the sky, far, far away, where the Quagmire triplets would live in safety with Hector. They looked out at the landscape where Count Olaf had ridden off with Esme Squalor to find his associates and cook up another scheme. They looked back at Nevermore Tree, where the VFD crows were muttering together for their evening roost, and then they looked out at the world where families everywhere would soon be reading about the three siblings in the special edition of the Daily Punctilio. It seemed to the Baudelaires that every creature in the world had been taken care of by others, every creature except for themselves. But the children, of course, could care for one another, as they had been caring for one another since that terrible day at the beach. Violet, Claus, and Sunny looked at one another and took a deep breath, gathering up all their courage to face all the bolts from the blue that they guessed, and I'm sorry to say, guessed correctly, lay ahead of them, and then the self-sustaining Baudelaire orphans took their first steps away from town toward the last few rays of the setting sun. And there's the picture at the end of the book.